Thank you. Thank you all for joining today. We'll begin shortly. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We're pleased to gather to discuss efforts to address orphan wells in California, including state funding and federal investments authorized in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Today, we will hear from two special guests, U.S. Senator Alex Padilla and Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot. My name is Andrea Ambrose. I'm the Deputy Secretary of External Affairs at the Natural Resources Agency. Today's webinar will be recorded and provides closed captioning, live transcript, and special translation options. I will turn it over to our interpreter to follow the directions for interpretation in Spanish. Elizabeth?
Gracias a todos por acompañarnos esta mañana. Nos complace que se hayan reunido con nosotros para hablar sobre los esfuerzos para abordar los puestos huérfanos en California, incluyendo los fondos estatales y las inversiones federales autorizadas en la Ley de Infraestructura Bipartidista. Hoy vamos a escuchar a dos invitados especiales, el senador estadounidense Alex Padilla y el secretario de Recursos Naturales Wade Crowfoot. Soy Andrea Ambrose y seré su facilitadora el día de hoy. El seminario web de hoy se va a grabar y va a ofrecer transcripción en vivo con subtítulos y opciones de interpretación al español. Para acceder a la interpretación, después de que yo proporcione las instrucciones, va a aparecer en la parte inferior de su pantalla un globo que dice Interpretation, es decir, interpretación. Van a seleccionar ese botón y seleccionar Spanish, es decir, español. Si el día de hoy se está conectando a través de un iPad o de un teléfono inteligente, van a aparecer tres puntos que dicen More. Van a seleccionar esa opción y seleccionar opciones de interpretación. Posteriormente, lo que dice español. En este momento aceptaré mi función como intérprete y va a aparecer estas opciones. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We thank you all for pre-submitting questions and we'll effort to address as many as possible during our time today. And we encourage you to contact our office for additional questions. We thank you, Senator and Secretary, for your time today. And with that, I'd like to introduce U.S. Senator Alex Padilla and
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining, and huge thanks, Senator Padilla, not only for joining and your interest in this topic, but your leadership on the bipartisan infrastructure law, and specifically to ensure the inclusion of federal funding for the problem of orphan wells, which is really a problem national in scope. We all know that these are defunct wells that do not have a legally responsible party to safely and permanently seal them. And your leadership, your voice in Washington, D.C. Resulted in significant federal funding, really for the first time in a generation for this problem. And greatly appreciate you being with us today to talk about this issue, this challenge, and this opportunity we have in California to tackle this problem. I'll take some time after hearing from you to share a little bit about the problem in California and how we're tackling it. But first, if you would, please do share thoughts that you have on this topic. And once again, thank you for your leadership. And I think you might be muted.
2 years of COVID and we still forget to unmute. Thank you everybody for joining us. And I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, not just for your kind introduction, but for your partnership in my prior capacities, certainly since day one that I've been representing California as a senator on this and so many other issues. And everybody tuning in, thank you for joining us for what is some pretty significant news. You know, I've been proud to highlight the major federal funding that's coming to California in a number of categories, but today specifically we're focusing on the resources now available to help us clean up unused oil and gas wells. California will receive more than $61 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law to safely shut down wells that are sitting idle. So not wells that are in use, they are idle and threatening the surrounding environment. How is that the case? When oil and gas wells are left unplugged, they put Californians in danger. Abandoned wells pollute our air and they pollute drinking water. Abandoned wells leak gases that cause sickness and a lot of illnesses, including cancer in some cases. And the harms don't just stop there. Orphan wells also emit methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas that is serving to accelerate the climate crisis around the world that we're working so hard to try to reverse. To take on the climate crisis, we must stop harmful greenhouse gases, and that's precisely the urgency behind advocating for funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law to plug these idle wells. California, if you want to know the scope of the problem here, California is home to thousands of wells that haven't been used in more than a decade. So they're not recently abandoned. They've been sitting there idly polluting the environment for more than a decade. And the Central Valley in particular is heavily impacted by thousands of wells. In many areas around these abandoned wells, children are growing up where abandoned oil wells are spreading the toxins in their backyards and even in school playgrounds. This is a real harsh reality that so many Californians have been subjected to. In Los Angeles, 500,000 people live within just half a mile of a well, one of the highest rates and concentrations in the nation. So again, I'm proud to work with Secretary Crawford to secure as much funding as possible for California to plug these wells. With the funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law, California can now not just develop, but implement a strategic plan to clean up these idle wells. The programs we're talking about will protect communities, will reduce toxic emissions, and create good paying jobs at the same time. So thank you all again for tuning in today to learn about this important grant program. Look forward to working with everybody to build a more sustainable future for everybody. Back to you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thanks so much. And, as you point out, this is a huge problem in California and throughout the country. And as I'll explain in just a moment, California has been addressing this issue, but we recognize that we have to address it at a much larger scale. And that's really where federal leadership and funding that you've been driving is really coming into play. Thanks to this federal funding, we're going to take a quantum leap in the amount of orphan wells that we're able to safely and permanently seal. And that's a really big deal for communities and for our environment. I want to provide a little context for those who have tuned in around the challenge we face, and would ask my colleagues to bring up a short PowerPoint presentation. Now, most of us in California know that oil has been produced or extracted in California for a very long time, beginning well over 100 years ago. And interestingly, that production really peaked in the 1980s. And since, I believe it's 1984, year over year, the amount of oil that's been produced or extracted in California has been declining. And with that decline in production means that wells that were drilled to produce oil, many of them no longer produce oil, and they become idle. Idle means an unused well. If an idle well ultimately can shift to what we know as a deserted well, where it's idle and essentially no party is claiming responsibility for that well, and it's essentially been deserted. An orphaned well, which we're talking about here today, is a defunct well, no longer producing, that has no responsible party to clean it up. Now, in California, we have strengthened our idle well management policies, which means oil companies that are producing oil need to take responsibility for their idle wells. And they either need to bring those wells back into production, or they need to safely and permanently seal those wells. So the funding that we are talking about today, that we're very thankful for Senator Padilla for driving, are not to address idle wells that are the legal responsibility of an oil producer. They are to focus on those orphaned wells that don't have any legally responsible party, and frankly won't get cleaned up without governmental leadership. So we've been focused on stronger management of idle wells, either put it back into production or safely and permanently seal this, and now tackling this abandoned well challenge. Next slide. So what is the scale of our problem in California? According to our division that oversees oil production, which is the California Geologic Energy Management Division, or CalGEM, over 5,000 wells in California are known to either be orphaned, deserted, or potentially deserted wells. And then we estimate significantly more, almost 3 times more, potentially the undocumented orphaned wells from a very long time ago. Estimates that have been made that estimate the cost to permanently and safely seal that number of wells is upwards of over $900 million. And we are proud that CalGEM, that division that oversees oil production, in recent years has been taking on this problem, but at a much smaller scale than the challenge requires. And just to give you a little sense of that scale, CalGEM in recent years has spent, for example, in 2016, 2017, to give you a sense, they expended more than $9 million to plug and abandon 70 wells. And there's ongoing efforts at around that scale to continue to plug wells. But we've plugged dozens of abandoned wells, and we have thousands of abandoned wells out there, which is why the federal funding is so important. We are excited with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which, as the senator said, is going to fund resources. We also are getting formula funding from the federal government as a result of leadership from the Biden-Harris administration. We anticipate about $165 million coming into the state thanks to this federal leadership. Governor Newsom has also proposed an additional $200 million in the state budget being discussed here in Sacramento to add to that $165 million in federal funding to provide $365 million to safely address orphaned wells. If we are successful working with the legislature to secure this funding, the state and the federal funding will let our colleagues at CalGEM contract significantly more resources to protect abandoned wells. And it's really important that we prioritize those orphaned wells that pose the greatest threat to vulnerable communities. And so it's really critical to note that CalGEM, our agency overseeing oil production, has developed a draft screening and prioritization methodology. Essentially, that's a fancy way to say our folks are identifying where orphan wells present the biggest health and safety risk. And we'll use that methodology to then prioritize this federal and state funding to permanently and safely seal those orphan wells closest to communities where health vulnerabilities are most significant. And this methodology does account for our most vulnerable communities, disadvantaged communities. And this draft methodology utilizes what we call Cal Enviro Screen, which helps us understand the communities that face the largest environmental burdens and ensuring that those communities are prioritized in this methodology to identify where we tackle the orphan wells with highest priority. So we are really excited with this scaled up federal investment. Frankly, it's a game changer. We're hopeful that Governor Newsom's proposal is embraced by the legislature. We're committed to taking a greater scale of action with greater urgency to address the orphan well issue. And we wanted to share today one, our thanks to you, Senator Padilla, because you've been driving this issue behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. And then two, just bring everybody up to speed, community-based organizations, leaders, groups that focus on this to understand just where we're at tackling this challenge. I want to turn to, we've received some questions that I want to get to, and I'll seek to answer some of them. And I should mention that we have our oil and gas supervisor, Uduak Ntuk, on the line. Uduak has been driving this whole effort as a leader at CalGEM. So big thanks, Uduak, for your work. Senator Padilla, just interested in first of all, any reactions you have to the work that we're doing in California and how we're tackling such an enormous challenge.
Yeah. Well, again, California is leading the way. We're not just the most populous and diverse state in the nation with the largest economy of any state in the nation, but when it comes to, like you mentioned, idle and distinctly separate abandoned oil wells, it poses a risk at a scale that not many other states can relate to. So this is not just a California priority, but California is disproportionately impacted, and it makes the use of federal resources to add to the state commitment to address the problem that much more significant. That's number one. Number two, as with all aspects, frankly, of what's funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law, it's not just funding for infrastructure for the sake of funding for infrastructure, but being as strategic and equitable with how we invest these dollars. So to your point, having the environmental screening and environmental justice considerations for how projects will be prioritized should let Californians know that we're being effective, efficient, and equitable with the funding.
That's so helpful. Can you break down a little bit about the federal funding? I think we had talked about funding from initial grants and then formula funding, and it's just a remarkable amount of money, and frankly, far more than we've ever had to tackle this issue. Right,
and I think it's not just the press that's interested. I know local government and private sector partners are wondering how much money are we talking about. So to be a little bit more specific, based on the information we have today, there's a couple of pools that the money will be coming from. California, from what we understand, is eligible to receive up to $165 million, use that figure, $165,871,000 across two grant categories. So that includes $25 million in some initial grant funds that are going to move pretty quickly, which we expect to receive this summer, actually, so in the very near future. And then separately, approximately $140 million in formula grant funds to be rolled out over the next couple of years. Again, that's a bigger number because the population, the number of wells in California, et cetera, is larger than other states. Now, the federal program also will include some performance grants, but we're still waiting on additional guidance from the U.S. Department of Interior as to amounts and timelines and criteria for the performance grants. But to start with, nearly $166 million to augment the state commitment. That's huge, absolutely huge. And as I mentioned, our administration under Governor Newsom has a proposal for $200 million in the current budget discussions. And if that proposal is ultimately adopted by our legislature, we would have $100 million in state funding in the budget year that starts this summer, and then an additional $100 million in the subsequent budget year. I want to bring in Supervisor Ntuk to the conversation because obviously this is scaled up effort, and want to ask you, Uduak, first of all, help us understand this difference between idle wells and deserted wells and orphan wells. I gave the layperson's description, but you're obviously the expert. And then talk about how CalGEM plans to actually scale up the work given this federal funding.
Yeah, that's a great question. And good morning, everybody. And thank you again, Senator Padilla. We have oil operations in California for more than 150 years, actually. And we currently have about 137,000 idle wells statewide. We've increased our idle well program that now we are plugging and abandoning more wells than we drill new wells, almost a 5-to-1 ratio based on our strengthened program. But as far as
I want to put a point on that, Uduak, because you're saying that in terms of permits, there are 5 times more permits to permanently and safely seal wells than there are to drill new wells. So that sounds like the pace of closing down idle wells is really picked up.
It's been a dramatic change, and all paid for by the industry. Now, for the ones that we have identified, the 5,300 that are eligible for the federal funding, and potentially an additional 18,000 that we need to go out and evaluate. Those are wells that there's no fluid flow, there's no legal or viable operator. We're still going to do research and see if we can find any historical or any connections to find a responsible party where we can do liens or civil penalties to get the money back. That's part of our program. But as we scale up, Senator Padilla, was correct in the 25 million that's going to be coming this year will allow us to do a statewide assessment to quantify and verify all the locations, purchase software from the Groundwater Protection Council to make sure that we're protecting groundwater. And also we're going to be abandoning our first 200 wells that we're going to methane test. So we have not methane test wells in the past. So we're going to be able to get a new assessment of exactly how much greenhouse gas emissions are coming out in various wells across the state.
Uduak, that's really helpful. And just to break down some vocabulary of the industry, when we talk about abandoning wells in the vocabulary of this industry, abandon means to safely and permanently seal those wells, right?
Correct. So we have Orphan, we have abandon. The abandonment of a well is filling it with cement from the bottom to the top, isolating the hydrocarbon in the water zones to make sure that no fluid can flow out of it and make sure that there's no emissions coming to the surface.
Thank you. And Senator Padilla really emphasized the importance of prioritizing addressing the orphan wells that provide the greatest public health and safety impact to vulnerable communities. Can you talk a little bit more about the methodology you all are creating to prioritize those wells that present the worst risk and danger? And specifically for those who want to understand more about this draft methodology, is there a place that they can look for it or better understand it?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've had a couple of public workshops already to solicit input, and we'll have an additional workshop. It's really it's where proximity to people, proximity to environmental justice communities, imminent environmental harm or proximity to ocean or waterway. We do have some unplugged wells in the beach off of Santa Barbara, but we also have thousands across like LA County that are near homes and businesses that we're going to be focusing on first. And so part of this methodology, we're going to go through also with local governments to confirm the location, and they may know of wells that we don't know about because over the last 100 years, not all the wells were properly documented or disclosed to the government.
That's really helpful. So there's $25 million that's being provided by the federal government this summer will really help us assess and inventory those orphaned wells and finalize the methodology to prioritize those wells. And Uduak, what I hear you saying too is that if there are local governments or community-based organizations and they want to raise their hand and identify orphan wells to make sure they're on the list or connect with you to better understand and shape that methodology for prioritizing wells, it sounds like CalGEM has some public dialogue underway.
Yes, we have workshops, we have a web page, we have an email address that we can provide, if you just Google CalGEM orphan wells, it should come up. But we have all the information online and transparently available. That's really
helpful. And then how many wells do you anticipate safely and permanently sealing these orphan wells like this year and coming months?
Well, the first contract we have is about 200 wells, and that will be more than we've done in the last decade. I mean, this has been a dramatic scale up, but we know this is going to be, a decades-long program that's been established under the infrastructure bill, and this will be a multi-year scale up of funding to both state and federal funding as we move forward. But at least in the short term, 200, we project we can do about 1,100 wells based with the funding that we know is available now. But there's actually more funding that's supposed to come in the future in the next round of allocations from the Department of Interior.
Thanks. And I'll just mention that our colleague Christina has put in the chat the webpage for you to find out more information about what Supervisor Intuk is talking about. If you would, Supervisor, Senator Padilla talked about the economic opportunity of this work for folks that are working in the oil fields. Can you talk about what this could look like in coming years if the federal government and the state government continue to invest in sealing orphaned wells?
Yeah, the other element of this is a jobs program. So these are good paying jobs. Our contracts were now adding prevailing wage requirements to make sure that we're paying a living wage that will have healthcare and retirement benefits tied to it. It's also an opportunity for our partners in labor, and particularly the operating engineers and laborers, to have work opportunities that you come from a labor hall and go and work on plugging and abandoning a well. And we also, in the governor's budget, is a proposal to increase the apprenticeships that are the pipeline into those trades, that those are opportunities for local Californians to get the skills and training to help clean up our own communities.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, the scale of the orphan wells that we have to address is daunting, but I think the silver lining is that we have really well-trained workers across California to do this job. And if we invest the funding, those folks will have jobs to do this important environmental work. Senator, we're coming up to the end of our half an hour debrief for the press and community groups and stakeholders. Just interested in any sort of concluding remarks as we round third and head home with our briefing here.
No, thank you again for your leadership at the state level, for your partnership and your commitment to not just help us successfully advocate for the federal funding, but now making sure it's having the impact and the benefits to Californians and our environment that we intend. We've gone through the numbers, we've gone through the number of wells and what people should expect over the next couple of months, the next few years. I just want to underscore one last time, it's come up a couple of times already, but that it's not just a significant investment, which is necessary, but that we're doing it thoughtfully. I'll let you decide if you want to get into the details of the Cal EnviroScreen methodology and how we're applying environmental justice data to the prioritization of the wells that will be addressed sooner rather than later. But know that that's absolutely consistent with the spirit, the intent of what we advocated for through the federal budget. So just thank you all again. This is great news. And I think most people understand how important it is for people who live near orphaned wells that are polluting and poisoning our communities and our kids. You really know how significant this is. So again, appreciate the partnership, and we'll continue to work together.
Well, thanks so much. And thank you for emphasizing the point around prioritization of our work in the most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. And I will just mention that, Cal EnviroScreen is a careful tool that helps us identify those communities living with the greatest pollution burdens. And it factors in population, pollution burden, population characteristics. And so that Cal EnviroScreen score that really uplifts, identifies the most burdened communities is figuring into this methodology. So we anticipate that we will prioritize for federal and state funding permanently and safely sealing those orphaned wells that present the greatest potential health risk and are in those communities that are already facing other environmental burdens. And that is, of course, part of our shared commitment to redress inequity and to address environmental justice. So thanks for lifting that up. I'll lastly say, look, this federal funding, I said it once before, is a game changer. And I have to say, working at our Natural Resources Agency, thanks to you and thanks to others in the delegation, and of course, thanks to the president, we have more federal funding coming in for our environmental priorities than we have in a generation. And I can tell you that it makes a huge difference toward protecting communities, not only from these issues, but on issues like wildfire and drought, and then restoring our natural environment and improving environmental conservation. So just a huge thanks for all the work that you're doing, driving in Washington, D.C. It is making a difference, and it will continue to make a difference on the ground here in California.
Thank you.
Supervisor Untook, thank you for your leadership and your team. We're making progress. I think we all recognize we have a lot more work ahead of us on this orphan well issue. And for you all tuning in, thank you for your engagement and your interest. Please do log on to that website to get more information to help ensure that that tool that we have to prioritize wells makes sense and is understandable. And we've also provided an email address if you have specific questions that you want answered or input that you want to provide. Thanks once again for joining us, and Senator Padilla, thanks for all the work you're doing in Washington, D.C. Please let us know how we can continue to help you here from California.
Will do. Thank you.